The heart monitor's flat line pierced through the chaos of gunfire echoing across the Afghan mountainside. Commander Jake Morrison, the most decorated SEAL in Team 7, lay motionless on the rocky ground, his pulse gone, his breathing stopped. While bullets whistled overhead and enemy forces closed in from 3 directions, the team's quiet medic, Cassandra Rivers, had exactly 3 minutes before brain death would become irreversible. What she did next defied every medical protocol she'd ever learned and shocked her teammates so profoundly that none of them would ever speak about it publicly again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cassandra Rivers had always been different from the other Navy medics. While her peers debated treatment protocols over coffee in the base medical facility, she spent her free time studying ancient emergency medicine techniques that most modern practitioners had abandoned decades ago. Her fellow SEALs nicknamed her Ghost, not because she moved silently through combat zones, though she did, but because she had an unsettling ability to appear exactly where wounded soldiers needed her most, often before they even realized they were injured. The morning of September 15, 2019, began like any other patrol day in the Kunar province. Team 7 had been tracking a high-value target through the treacherous mountain passes for 6 days, following intelligence that suggested their target was coordinating attacks on NATO supply convoys from a fortified compound nestled deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The terrain was brutal, even by Afghan standards, jagged rocks that could slice through boots, altitude that left even the most conditioned operators gasping, and weather that shifted from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold within hours. Commander Jake Morrison had led Team 7 through 17 successful missions in this deployment alone. At 34, he was considered old for active SEAL operations, but his tactical brilliance and ability to bring every man home had earned him legendary status within the special operations community. Morrison never spoke about his previous deployments, never boasted about confirmed kills, never displayed the bravado that some younger operators wore like armor. He led through example, making decisions with the cold precision of a chess master and the protective instincts of a father watching over his children. The team consisted of 8 operators, each selected for specialized skills that complemented the others perfectly. There was Tommy Rodriguez, the communication specialist who could establish satellite contact from the bottom of a cave. Marcus Thompson, the demolitions expert who could calculate explosive yields in his head while under fire. David Chun, the sniper whose longest confirmed kill was still classified. Brothers Michael and Stephen Walsh, twins whose synchronized movements in close-quarters combat had become the stuff of SEAL legend. Antonio Garcia, the intelligence analyst who spoke 7 languages fluently. Kyle Anderson, the weapons specialist who could repair any firearm with spare parts and determination. And Cassandra Rivers, whose medical expertise had saved more lives than anyone kept count of. What made Cassandra unique wasn't just her medical skills, though those were exceptional. She had completed additional training in combat psychology, battlefield surgery, and what the military euphemistically called extreme environment medicine techniques for keeping people alive in conditions that would make most emergency rooms look like comfortable waiting rooms. But her teammates had noticed something else about her over the months they'd worked together. She seemed to understand the human body in ways that went beyond textbook knowledge, as if she could sense when someone's physiology was about to fail before any symptoms appeared. 3 weeks earlier, during a routine patrol near Jalalabad, Cassandra had suddenly stopped the entire squad and insisted that Rodriguez needed immediate medical attention. Rodriguez had protested. He felt fine, had no symptoms, was ready to continue the mission. But Cassandra's expression carried such certainty that Morrison ordered a halt. Within 10 minutes, Rodriguez collapsed from internal bleeding caused by a fragment of shrapnel that had been slowly working its way through his abdomen for days. The fragment had been too small to detect on standard medical scans, and Rodriguez had attributed the minor discomfort to the physical demands of their deployment. If they hadn't stopped when they did, the fragment would have punctured his liver, and he would have died before they could reach medical evacuation. Incident had cemented Cassandra's reputation within the team, but it had also created an unspoken tension. Some of the operators weren't entirely comfortable with her uncanny ability to predict medical emergencies. In a profession where survival depended on understanding and controlling variables, Cassandra represented something that couldn't be quantified or explained through standard training. Protocols. The target they'd been tracking for 6 days was Ahmed Nazir, a former Taliban commander who had transitioned into coordinating attacks for a loose coalition of extremist groups. Intelligence suggested that Nazir had been responsible for orchestrating the bombing of a medical facility that had killed 12 civilians, including 4 children. The mission parameters were clear: capture if possible, eliminate if necessary, and gather any intelligence that might prevent future attacks on civilian targets. The approach to Nazir's compound required a grueling climb-up terrain that seemed designed to break the human spirit. The rocks were loose enough to create treacherous footing, but stable enough that rappelling equipment was useless. The altitude made every breath feel insufficient, and the constant threat of enemy observation meant they couldn't use the established trails that local villagers had carved over generations. Morrison had planned their route to take advantage of natural cover while maintaining multiple escape routes. The team would establish an observation post on a ridge overlooking the compound, conduct surveillance to determine the number of hostiles present, then execute a coordinated assault designed to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing their chances of capturing Nazir alive. As they climbed, Cassandra found herself studying Morrison more closely than usual. He was moving well, maintaining the steady pace that had characterized his leadership throughout their deployment. But something in his breathing pattern, something in the way he occasionally paused to scan the terrain, suggested to her trained eye that his body was operating under more stress than he was acknowledging. She'd seen the same subtle indicators in patients who were hours away from cardiac events, not obvious symptoms that would show up on standard medical evaluations, but microscopic changes in movement patterns, breathing rhythms, and stress responses that indicated cardiovascular systems operating beyond sustainable limits. The night before, she'd noticed Morrison reviewing mission plans with an intensity that went beyond his usual thorough preparation. He'd been cross-referencing satellite imagery with topographical maps, calculating and recalculating approach vectors, and studying intelligence reports with the focused concentration of someone who suspected they were missing a crucial piece of information. When she'd quietly asked if he needed medical attention, he'd given her the same response that every special operations leader gave when questioned about their physical condition: he was fine. The mission came first. Personal concerns were irrelevant, but Cassandra's training had taught her to trust physiological indicators over verbal assurances. Morrison's stress markers suggested someone whose cardiovascular system was compensating for underlying problems that hadn't yet manifested as obvious symptoms. His resting heart rate had been elevated for 3 days. His sleep patterns showed signs of interruption even when conditions allowed for rest, and his hydration levels indicated that his body was retaining fluid in ways that suggested his heart wasn't processing circulation as efficiently as it should. She'd considered approaching Morrison directly about her concerns, but she also understood the dynamics of special operations teams. Questioning a commander's fitness without clear justification could undermine unit cohesion and mission effectiveness. Morrison had never given any indication that he was experiencing physical problems, and his performance had remained consistent with the standards that had made him legendary within the SEAL community. As they reached the final approach to their observation post, the terrain became even more challenging. The rocks were loose enough that each step required careful placement, and the angle of ascent meant they were essentially climbing while carrying full combat loads. Morrison maintained his position at the front of the formation, setting the pace and choosing the route with the experience of someone who had navigated similar terrain dozens of times. But Cassandra noticed that his movement patterns were subtly different from previous operations. The changes were microscopic, a slight alteration in his breathing rhythm during exertion, a barely perceptible modification in how he distributed his weight while climbing, tiny adjustments in his posture that suggested his body was compensating for something. To anyone else, Morrison appeared to be performing exactly as expected. To Cassandra's trained eye, he looked like someone whose physiology was operating at the edge of sustainable limits. The observation post they'd selected provided excellent visibility of the target compound while offering multiple escape routes if they were discovered. Morrison positioned each team member according to their specialties. Chun established a sniper position with clear lines of sight to the compound's entrances. Rodriguez set up communications equipment to maintain contact with base operations, and the Walsh brothers positioned themselves to provide security for the team's flanks. As they settled into position for what would likely be several hours of surveillance, Cassandra found herself watching Morrison with increasing concern. His stress indicators were becoming more pronounced, though still subtle enough that she doubted anyone else would notice. His breathing was slightly elevated for someone in a stationary position. His pulse was visible in his neck at a rate that suggested cardiovascular strain, and his skin tone showed the microscopic changes that often preceded serious cardiac events. She was facing a dilemma that every combat medic understood, but hoped never to encounter. Morrison was showing early warning signs of potential cardiovascular failure, but those signs were subtle enough that questioning his fitness could be seen as undermining his command authority. More critically, they were in the middle of a mission where removing the team leader could compromise the safety of all 8 operators. As the hours passed and they gathered intelligence on the target compound, Cassandra's medical training continued to register changes in Morrison's physiology that painted an increasingly concerning picture. His body was showing signs of someone whose cardiovascular system was being pushed beyond sustainable limits, but who was using determination and tactical focus to maintain operational effectiveness despite mounting physiological stress. The compound below revealed its secrets slowly as Team 7 maintained their surveillance through the afternoon heat. Through high-powered optics, they counted 14 armed individuals moving between 3 buildings, with what appeared to be a sophisticated communication setup on the main structure's roof. Rodriguez intercepted radio chatter suggesting that Nazier was indeed present, coordinating with cells across the province from this mountain stronghold. Morrison's tactical assessment was methodical and precise. He identified the compound's defensive positions, mapped the likely locations of weapons caches, and calculated approach vectors that would minimize exposure while maximizing tactical advantage. His decades of experience showed in how he processed the intelligence, weighing variables that less experienced operators might overlook. The compound's position on a natural plateau provided excellent defensive advantages for its occupants, but Morrison identified 3 potential weaknesses that could be exploited by a coordinated assault. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chun reported that the compound's security was more sophisticated than initial intelligence had suggested. Through his scope, he identified at least 2 sniper positions that commanded overlapping fields of fire, plus defensive positions that indicated the occupants were expecting potential attacks. This wasn't a casual hideout, it was a fortress designed by someone who understood modern military tactics. "They've got infrared detection equipment," Chun whispered into his radio. "Professional-grade stuff, not the amateur setup we were briefed to expect." Morrison absorbed this information without changing his expression, but Cassandra noticed his jaw muscles tighten slightly, a stress response that suggested his body was processing more tension than he was acknowledging. His tactical mind was undoubtedly recalculating the mission parameters, weighing the increased complexity against their operational Objectives: the Walsh brothers had identified potential escape routes and established security perimeters, but their reports indicated that the terrain offered limited options if the team needed to withdraw under fire. The mountain's geography created natural choke points that could trap them if enemy reinforcements arrived from the valley below. As the surveillance continued, Morrison began developing what he called his three-phase approach, a tactical plan that would allow them to adapt based on how the situation evolved once they initiated contact. Phase 1 involved neutralizing the compound's communications capabilities to prevent calls for reinforcement. Phase 2 focused on establishing control over the compound's defensive positions while minimizing casualties among any civilians who might be present. Phase 3 centered on locating and capturing Nazir while gathering intelligence materials. Thompson studied the compound structures through binoculars, identifying potential explosive hazards and calculating blast radii that would neutralize defensive positions without bringing down entire buildings. His expertise in demolitions made him acutely aware of how quickly a tactical assault could turn into a civilian casualty situation if explosives were used carelessly. Garcia analyzed the intercepted communications, building a picture of the compound's command structure and daily routines. His linguistic skills allowed him to understand not just the words being transmitted, but the cultural contexts and implied meanings that often contained more important information than direct statements. Anderson maintained their weapon systems and monitored the team's equipment status, ensuring that every piece of gear was functioning at optimal levels. In special operations, equipment failures during critical moments could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But it was Cassandra who noticed that something fundamental had changed in their environment. The mountain itself seemed to be shifting around them in ways that had nothing to do with the tactical situation they were observing. The air pressure felt different, though weather reports hadn't indicated any incoming storm systems. The wildlife had gone silent in a pattern that suggested something beyond normal predator activity. Even the insects had stopped their constant buzzing, creating an unnatural quiet that made every sound from the compound below seem amplified. More concerning to her trained medical instincts were the physiological changes she was observing in Morrison. His stress responses were escalating beyond what the tactical situation warranted, as if his body was reacting to threats that hadn't yet manifested. His pupils were slightly dilated despite the afternoon light. His breathing had developed an almost imperceptible irregularity, and she could see a faint tremor in his hands that he was compensating for through conscious control. These weren't symptoms of fear or normal combat stress. Morrison had faced far more dangerous situations without showing these kinds of physiological responses. Instead, they looked like the early warning signs of someone whose cardiovascular system was approaching failure, but whose conscious mind hadn't yet recognized the danger. The afternoon wore on as Team 7 gathered the intelligence needed to execute their assault. Morrison's tactical plan evolved with each piece of new information, becoming increasingly sophisticated as he identified solutions to the defensive challenges the compound presented. His leadership was as sharp as ever, his decision-making process as methodical and effective as it had been throughout 17 previous missions. But Cassandra found herself facing an impossible choice. Her medical training was screaming that Morrison was showing signs of impending cardiovascular crisis, yet he was performing his command duties flawlessly. Questioning his fitness at this moment could undermine the entire mission and potentially endanger the lives of all 8 team members. Special operations culture demanded absolute trust in leadership, and medical concerns that couldn't be definitively proven were considered subordinate to mission requirements. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Morrison made the decision to initiate the assault during the approaching twilight. The reduced visibility would provide tactical advantages for their approach, and intelligence suggested that the compound security was most relaxed during evening meal preparation, final equipment checks, Morrison commanded quietly. "We move in 20 minutes." The team began their pre-assault routines with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had executed similar operations dozens of times. Each operator verified their weapon systems, communications equipment, and specialized gear. Rodriguez confirmed satellite communication links with base operations. Chun adjusted his scope for the changing light conditions. The Walsh brothers synchronized their movement patterns for the coordinated breach they would execute, but as Morrison stood to begin moving toward the assault position, something in his movement pattern triggered every alarm in Cassandra's medical training. His balance was slightly off, compensated for so subtly that anyone without her background wouldn't notice. His breathing pattern had developed an irregularity that suggested his heart was beginning to struggle with maintaining adequate circulation. Most critically, she could see microscopic changes in his skin tone that indicated decreased oxygen efficiency. Morrison was in the early stages of cardiac distress, but his conscious mind either hadn't recognized the symptoms or was suppressing them through sheer force of will. In a civilian environment, these would be clear indicators for immediate medical attention. In combat operations, they created a dilemma that had no clear solution. The team began their movement toward the compound with Morrison leading from the front, as he always did. His navigation was flawless, his tactical awareness as sharp as ever. He identified and avoided potential hazards, selected routes that provided optimal cover, and maintained the careful pace that would bring them into assault position at exactly the right time. Cassandra moved behind him, watching for any escalation in his symptoms while simultaneously preparing herself for the medical emergencies that combat operations often created. Her medical pack contained everything needed to treat gunshot wounds, explosive injuries, and trauma situations. But it also contained equipment for cardiac emergencies, though she'd never expected to use it on a SEAL commander in the middle of an assault. Descent toward the compound required careful navigation through terrain that became increasingly treacherous as daylight faded. Loose rocks could create noise that would alert the compound's security, while the changing light conditions made it difficult to identify stable footing. Morrison's leadership during this phase was masterful. He moved with the confidence of someone who had navigated similar terrain under similar conditions countless times before. But Cassandra could see that his body was paying a price for maintaining this level of performance. His stress responses were escalating, his cardiovascular system was showing increasing signs of strain, and his movement pattern suggested someone who was beginning to rely more on determination than physical capability. As they reached the final approach phase, Morrison positioned each team member according to the tactical plan they'd developed during surveillance. Chun moved into a position that would allow him to provide sniper support during the assault. Rodriguez established communications in a location that offered both concealment and clear transmission lines to base operations. Thompson prepared his demolitions equipment for neutralizing the compound's defensive positions. The Walsh brothers moved into position for the coordinated breach that would begin the assault phase of their operation. Their synchronization was flawless, the result of years of training and the almost telepathic understanding that some military units develop over time. Garcia positioned himself to provide intelligence support and translation services if they encountered non-combatants during the assault. Anderson maintained their weapon systems and prepared to provide suppressive fire if the tactical situation required it. Morrison took his position at the center of the formation, where he could command the assault while maintaining visual contact with all team members. His tactical positioning was perfect, demonstrating the leadership skills that had made him legendary within the special operations community. But as the final moments before the assault ticked away, Cassandra found herself watching Morrison with increasing alarm. His stress indicators were approaching levels that suggested imminent cardiovascular failure, yet he was maintaining command effectiveness through what appeared to be pure force of will. Mountain around them had grown completely silent, as if the environment itself was holding its breath before the violence that was about to unfold. In this unnatural quiet, Cassandra could hear Morrison's breathing, and what she heard made her medical training scream, warnings that she couldn't voice without potentially compromising the mission and endangering every member of the team. Morrison raised his hand, preparing to give the signal that would initiate the assault. In the fading twilight, with enemy forces just meters away, Team 7 prepared to execute the operation they'd been planning and training for. But Cassandra knew that in the next few minutes, she might face a medical emergency that would test everything she'd learned about keeping people alive under impossible conditions. Morrison's hand remained frozen in the air, poised to give the assault signal that would send 8 elite operators into coordinated action. But something had changed in the few seconds since he'd raised his arm. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, though he was trying to control it. A thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the cooling mountain air. Most critically, Cassandra could see a slight tremor in his raised hand that suggested his nervous system was beginning to falter. The compound below remained unaware of their presence. Through their optics, the team could see enemy combatants moving through their evening routines, completely oblivious to the lethal force positioned just meters away. The tactical moment was perfect. Visibility was optimal for their night vision equipment, while remaining inadequate for the compound's defenders. Wind conditions wouldn't affect Chun's shots, and the target security appeared to be at its most relaxed state. But Morrison hadn't given the signal. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, barely audible. "Commander, do you copy?" "Ready for green light." Morrison's jaw worked as if he was trying to form words, but no sound emerged. His eyes remained focused on the compound, his tactical mind still processing the situation. But something fundamental was disconnecting between his consciousness and his ability to command the assault. Chun, positioned 30 meters to the east, had a clear shot at the compound's primary communications array. His crosshairs were steady on the target, his breathing controlled, finger resting lightly on the trigger. All he needed was Morrison's signal to begin the operation that would cascade through each phase of their carefully planned assault. The Walsh brothers held their positions at opposite ends of the compound's main building, ready to execute the synchronized breach that would begin the close-quarters phase of their operation. Their timing had been rehearsed dozens of times, their movements coordinated to the split second. But without Morrison's signal, they remained motionless in the gathering darkness. Thompson had calculated explosive charges that would neutralize defensive positions without causing structural collapse that might harm civilians potentially being held in the compound. His finger hovered over the detonation controls, waiting for the command sequence that would begin with Morrison's raised hand dropping to initiate the assault. Garcia monitored enemy communications, listening for any indication that their presence had been detected. The radio chatter from the compound remained routine discussions about meal preparation, shift changes, and mundane logistical matters. Nothing suggested that the enemy forces suspected 8 of America's most elite soldiers were positioned just outside their perimeter. Anderson maintained overwatch on their equipment and weapon systems, ensuring that every piece of gear remained at peak operational readiness. His role during the assault would be to provide suppressive fire and equipment support. But first Morrison needed to give the signal that would transform their careful surveillance into explosive action. But Morrison's raised hand had begun to shake more visibly, and Cassandra could see that his breathing had become irregular in ways that suggested his cardiovascular system was failing rapidly. His pupils were dilated beyond what the light conditions warranted. His skin tone had shifted to a pallor that indicated decreased circulation, and she could see the pulse point in his neck beating with an erratic rhythm that spoke of cardiac distress. Morrison was experiencing the early stages of cardiac arrest, but his conscious mind was still trying to process the tactical situation and command the assault. His body was shutting down while his brain continued to function, creating a medical emergency unlike anything Cassandra had encountered in her training. "Commander," she whispered through the radio. Requesting medical assessment, Morrison turned toward her, and she could see in his eyes the confusion of someone whose body was betraying him at the worst possible moment. He understood what was happening but couldn't accept it, couldn't process the possibility that his physical condition might compromise a mission that 8 lives depended on. "Negative," he whispered back, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining control. "Mission ... proceeds ... but even as he spoke those words, Morrison's hand began to lower, not in the controlled gesture that would signal the assault, but in the involuntary movement of someone whose nervous system was beginning to shut down. His legs began to buckle, and only years of muscle memory and pure determination kept him upright. Cassandra faced a decision that would define not just this mission, but potentially the rest of her career. Morrison was experiencing cardiac failure that would likely prove fatal within minutes if left untreated. But treating him would require actions that would certainly compromise the mission and potentially endanger the entire team. The compound below continued its evening routines, unaware that the assault they'd been preparing for had stalled just meters from their perimeter. Enemy combatants moved between buildings, weapons were cleaned and maintained. Communications equipment hummed with routine traffic. The tactical window for assault remained optimal, but their commander was physically unable to initiate the operation. Morrison tried once more to raise his hand for the assault signal, but the gesture was weak and uncontrolled. His breathing had become labored, and Cassandra could see that he was fighting to remain conscious as his cardiovascular system struggled to maintain basic functionality. "Team 7, Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, requesting a status update. The other operators were beginning to sense that something was wrong. Morrison's silence was unprecedented. He'd never hesitated during the critical moments of an operation, never failed to communicate with his team during tactical phases. But they couldn't see his medical condition from their positions, couldn't understand that their commander was experiencing a cardiac emergency. Chun adjusted his scope and whispered, "Target acquired, ready for engagement." Awaiting green light, the Walsh brothers confirmed their breach positions and readiness to initiate close-quarters combat. Thompson verified his explosive charges and reported readiness to neutralize defensive positions. Garcia continued monitoring enemy communications for any sign that their presence had been detected. Anderson maintained equipment readiness and prepared to provide covering fire. Every member of Team 7 was positioned perfectly, equipped properly, and prepared mentally for the assault they'd planned and rehearsed. The tactical situation remained optimal, the target was vulnerable, and the mission objectives were within reach. But their commander was silently collapsing from cardiac failure just meters from enemy positions. Morrison made one final attempt to give the assault signal, raising his arm with tremendous effort. But as his hand reached its highest point, his cardiovascular system finally surrendered to the stress it had been fighting for hours. His eyes rolled back, his breathing stopped, and he collapsed onto the rocky ground with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the mountain. Silenced. The heart monitor, that was part of every SEAL's medical equipment, immediately began transmitting the flat line that indicated cardiac arrest. The electronic tone cut through the tactical radio frequency, alerting every member of Team 7 that their commander had just died. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "Command down! Command down! Medical emergency!" Chun's scope remained trained on the compound, but his attention was split between his sniper mission and the medical crisis that had just unfolded. The Walsh brothers held their breach positions, but were ready to abandon the assault if the team needed to evacuate their fallen commander. Thompson's finger moved away from his detonation controls as the mission parameters suddenly shifted from assault to medical evacuation. Garcia continued monitoring enemy communications, listening for any indication that Morrison's collapse had been detected by compound security. The sounds of his fall had been muffled by his tactical gear, But in the mountain stillness, even small noises could carry farther than expected. Anderson began calculating extraction routes that would allow them to remove Morrison's body while maintaining security, though the terrain and tactical situation made evacuation extremely difficult. They were positioned in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, with limited options for medical evacuation. But it was Cassandra who faced the most impossible choice. Morrison was clinically dead, no pulse, no breathing, no signs of life. Standard medical protocol in this situation would be to begin CPR immediately, but performing chest compressions on a SEAL commander during a tactical operation just meters from enemy positions would create noise that would certainly alert hostile forces to their presence. The assault they'd planned was no longer possible with Morrison down, but they couldn't simply abandon their positions without risking detection and a firefight they weren't prepared for. They needed their commander conscious and capable of leading them through whatever tactical situation developed next. Cassandra knelt beside Morrison's motionless form and checked for any signs of life. His pulse was gone, his breathing had stopped, and his skin was already beginning to take on the pallor of death. According to every medical protocol she'd ever learned, Morrison was beyond saving cardiac arrest in combat conditions, with limited medical equipment, at high altitude, with no possibility of advanced life support. But as she knelt there in the gathering darkness, listening to enemy forces just meters away, discussing their evening meal, Cassandra remembered something from her unconventional medical studies. Something that her training had dismissed as historical curiosity rather than practical technique. Something that no modern medic would attempt because it defied every established protocol for cardiac emergencies. The flatline tone continued to sound through the team's radio frequency, marking each second that passed without Morrison's heart beating. Brain death would become irreversible within 3 minutes. The tactical situation remained critical, with 8 operators positioned in enemy territory around a commander who showed no signs of life. And in that moment, with gunfire echoing from distant valleys and enemy voices drifting up from the compound below, Cassandra made a decision that would shock her teammates and change everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between life and death. Cassandra's hands moved to Morrison's chest, but instead of beginning the chest compressions that every combat medic was trained to perform, she did something that would have horrified her instructors at the Naval Medical Center. She placed her left palm flat against his sternum and her right hand over a specific point on his abdomen, applying pressure in a pattern that followed principles she'd studied in ancient Chinese medical texts, rather than modern emergency protocols. The technique was called shock point revival, a method that traditional healers had used for centuries to restart hearts that had stopped due to trauma or extreme stress. Modern medicine had abandoned it decades ago, dismissing it as superstition without scientific basis. But Cassandra had spent months studying historical accounts of battlefield medics who had successfully revived soldiers using techniques that predated modern cardiac resuscitation. By hundreds of years. She began applying rhythmic pressure to specific nerve clusters along Morrison's torso, targeting points that ancient medical texts claimed could stimulate the vagus nerve and trigger automatic responses in the cardiac muscle. Her movements were precise and deliberate, following sequences she'd memorized from manuscripts that most modern doctors would consider medieval nonsense. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "Ghost, what's your status?" "We need to know if we're extracting or continuing mission." Cassandra couldn't respond without alerting enemy forces to their position. The compound below remained unaware of their presence, but voices carried far in the mountain stillness, and radio transmissions could be detected by sophisticated surveillance equipment. She had to work in complete silence while Morrison's brain cells died by the thousands. With each passing second, the pressure point technique required her to maintain specific hand positions while applying force in calculated intervals. She pressed against nerve clusters below Morrison's ribcage, then moved to points along his cervical spine that ancient texts claimed could restart respiratory function. Her movements looked nothing like the CPR that her teammates expected. Instead of chest compressions, she was manipulating pressure points with the precision of someone performing acupuncture. Chen maintained his sniper position. Scope trained on the compound, but she could sense his confusion through the tactical radio. The Walsh brothers held their breach positions, but were undoubtedly wondering why they weren't hearing the rhythmic sounds of chest compressions that should accompany cardiac resuscitation. Thompson kept his explosives ready, but was probably calculating how quickly they could abort the mission if Morrison couldn't be revived. 60 seconds had passed since Morrison's heart stopped. His skin was taking on the grayish pallor of death, and his body temperature was beginning to drop as circulation ceased. According to every medical protocol Cassandra had learned, brain damage was already beginning. But the ancient techniques she was applying operated on different principles. They assumed that life force could be reactivated. Even after conventional signs of death appeared, she moved her hands to pressure points along Morrison's neck, applying force to areas where ancient texts claimed the life channels could be stimulated back into function. Her fingers found specific spots where major blood vessels passed close to the surface, and she began a rhythmic manipulation that looked more like massage than medical intervention. Garcia's voice whispered through the radio. Enemy patrol moving along the eastern perimeter. 3 hostiles, armed, approximately 200 meters from our position. Approximately 200 meters from our position. Tactical situation was deteriorating while Morrison remained clinically dead. Enemy forces were moving closer to their position. The mission window was closing, and their commander showed no signs of response to the unconventional treatment Cassandra was applying. But she continued working through the pressure point sequence, trusting techniques that had been used to revive warriors on ancient battlefields. At 90 seconds, she moved to what the text called the final revival points, specific locations along Morrison's spine where pressure could supposedly trigger the autonomous nervous system back into function. She positioned her thumbs against vertebrae at the base of his skull and applied firm, steady pressure while her other fingers manipulated nerve clusters along his upper back. The technique required her to maintain 3 different pressure points simultaneously, while applying force in specific rhythms that were supposed to correspond to natural heart rate patterns. Her hands moved in complex sequences that bore no resemblance to any modern medical procedure, following instructions she'd memorized from texts that most physicians would consider historical curiosities. Anderson's voice came through the radio. Movement in the compound. Looks like they're changing guard shifts. We've got maybe 10 minutes before security increases. 2 minutes had passed since Morrison's cardiac arrest. His body was completely limp, showing no signs of life, no response to the pressure point stimulation Cassandra was applying. The flatline tone continued to sound through their radio frequency, marking each second of clinical death. According to every medical standard she'd been taught, Morrison was beyond saving, but at 2 minutes and 15 seconds, something changed. Morrison's diaphragm contracted slightly, not the normal rhythm of breathing, but a single, involuntary spasm that suggested some neural activity was returning. Cassandra immediately shifted her hand positions to pressure points that the ancient texts claimed could strengthen respiratory function. She applied firm pressure to specific spots along his ribs, while maintaining contact with nerve clusters at the base of his skull. His diaphragm contracted again, then a third time. The movements were weak and irregular, but they indicated that some automatic functions were responding to the pressure point stimulation. Cassandra continued working through the sequence, applying pressure to points that were supposed to encourage cardiac muscle contractions. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Morrison's heart produced a single, weak beat. The sound registered on his heart monitor, not the steady rhythm of normal cardiac function, but one isolated contraction that proved the muscle was still capable of responding to stimulation. Cassandra immediately moved her hands to pressure points that the ancient texts claimed could encourage sustained heart rhythm. She applied firm pressure to a cluster of nerve endings below Morrison's left shoulder blade while maintaining contact with specific points along his sternum. The combination was supposed to create a feedback loop that would encourage the heart to resume regular contractions. Her movements were precise and deliberate, following sequences that required exact timing and pressure to be effective. Morrison's heart produced another beat, then a third. The rhythm was weak and irregular, but it was rhythm. His heart monitor began registering intermittent contractions instead of the flat line that had marked cardiac death. But he still wasn't breathing on his own, and his consciousness remained completely absent. Rodriguez whispered through the radio, "Ghost, we're seeing cardiac activity on the monitor. Status report?" Cassandra couldn't respond without risking detection, but she could sense her teammates' confusion. What they were monitoring through Morrison's medical equipment didn't match any cardiac resuscitation protocol they'd ever seen. Instead of the immediate, strong pulse that successful CPR sometimes produced, they were seeing gradual, irregular heartbeats that slowly increased in strength and frequency. At 2 minutes and 45 seconds, Morrison drew his first spontaneous breath. The inhalation was weak and shallow, but it was voluntary respiratory function. Cassandra immediately moved her hands to pressure points that ancient texts claimed could strengthen breathing patterns. She applied pressure to specific nerve clusters along his neck, while maintaining contact with points that were supposed to encourage deeper respiratory rhythm. Morrison's breathing became slightly stronger, though still irregular. His heart rate was slowly increasing, producing beats that were becoming more consistent in both strength and timing. But his eyes remained closed, and he showed no signs of consciousness or awareness of his surroundings. The compound below continued its evening routines, unaware that just meters away, one of America's most elite soldiers had just been brought back from clinical death using medical techniques that predated modern medicine by centuries. Enemy forces moved through their security patterns, while Morrison's vital signs slowly strengthened under Cassandra's continued pressure point manipulation. At exactly 3 minutes after cardiac arrest, Morrison's eyes opened. His pupils were dilated and unfocused, but they were responsive to light. His breathing had become more regular, though still shallow. His heart rate was approaching normal ranges, producing steady contractions that registered clearly on his medical monitor. But most importantly, he was conscious. Morrison tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper. "What happened?" Cassandra placed her hand over his mouth to prevent him from making noise that could alert enemy forces to their position. She leaned close to his ear and whispered so quietly that even the sensitive radio equipment couldn't pick up her words. "Cardiac arrest. You're alive. Stay quiet." Morrison's eyes showed confusion as he tried to process what had happened. His last clear memory was raising his hand to signal the assault. Everything after that was a blank void that his consciousness couldn't account for. But his tactical instincts remained intact. He understood they were in enemy territory and that silence was essential for survival. Shun's voice crackled through the radio. "Command, do you copy? We need to know mission status." Morrison tried to reach for his radio, but his motor control was still impaired by the cardiac event he'd experienced. Cassandra guided his hand to the transmit button and helped him key the microphone. His voice was weak but clear. "Team 7. Mission continues. Prepare for assault on my signal." The relief in Rodriguez's voice was audible. "Copy that, command." Standing by for green light, but Morrison's physical condition remained precarious. Although his heart was beating and he was breathing independently, he had experienced clinical death for 3 minutes. His cardiovascular system was functioning, but at reduced capacity. His motor control was improving but remained impaired. Most critically, he had no way of knowing whether his cognitive functions had been affected by the cardiac event. Morrison attempted to sit up, but his balance was unsteady. Cassandra helped support him while monitoring his vital signs for any indication that his heart might fail again. The pressure point technique had successfully restarted his cardiac and respiratory functions, but there was no guarantee that the effects would be permanent. "Can you command the assault?" Cassandra whispered. Morrison's tactical mind was already processing the situation. He understood that they were positioned for an assault that had been delayed by his medical emergency. He could hear enemy voices from the compound below and sense the positions of his team members through their radio communications. But he also understood that his physical condition might compromise his ability to lead effectively. He reached for his weapon and found that his grip strength was adequate, though not at full capacity. His vision was clear, his hearing was normal, and his tactical awareness seemed intact. The cardiac event had been traumatic, but it hadn't destroyed his ability to function as a SEAL commander. Mission ... "Proceeds," he whispered to Cassandra. "On my signal." Morrison raised his hand, the same gesture that had been interrupted by cardiac arrest just minutes earlier. But this time, his movement was controlled and deliberate. His teammates couldn't see the pallor in his skin or the slight tremor in his fingers that indicated ongoing physiological stress. All they knew was that their commander was conscious and ready to initiate the assault they'd been preparing for. The compound below remained unaware that the assault force positioned around their perimeter had just experienced a medical emergency that should have been fatal. Enemy combatants continued their evening routines while 8 elite operators prepared to transform careful surveillance into explosive action. And as Morrison's hand reached its highest point, preparing to drop in the signal that would begin the assault, Cassandra realized that what she'd done in the past 3 minutes would shock her teammates far more than anything they encountered. In the fighting that was about to begin, Morrison's hand dropped with deliberate precision, and Team 7 erupted into coordinated violence that had been building for hours of careful preparation. Chun's rifle cracked once, and the compound's primary communications array exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The electronic warfare phase of their assault had begun with surgical accuracy that ensured no calls for reinforcement could reach enemy forces in the valley below. The Walsh brothers moved simultaneously from opposite ends of the main building, their synchronized breach creating confusion that split enemy attention between 2 simultaneous threats. Michael detonated a shaped charge that blew the eastern door off its hinges while Stephen crashed through a western window in a cascade of glass and tactical precision. Their coordinated entry left enemy combatants unsure which direction the primary assault was coming from. Thompson's explosives neutralized 2 defensive positions with carefully calculated detonations that destroyed weapons emplacements without bringing down structural supports. His charges had been positioned to create maximum tactical advantage while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties if non-combatants were present in the compound. Rodriguez maintained communications blackout protocols while monitoring frequencies for any indication that the compound's destruction had been observed by distant enemy forces. His equipment registered the electromagnetic signature of the communications array's destruction, confirming that the target's ability to call for backup had been successfully eliminated. Garcia moved through the compound's outer perimeter, using his linguistic skills to distinguish between combatant voices and potential civilian presence. His analysis of overheard conversations would guide tactical decisions about which areas could be cleared with maximum force versus which required more careful approach. Anderson provided covering fire that suppressed enemy movement while maintaining ammunition discipline that would allow sustained engagement if the tactical situation required extended combat. His positioning allowed him to support multiple team members simultaneously while maintaining escape route security, but it was Morrison's leadership during these opening moments that demonstrated why he had become legendary within the special operations community. Despite having been clinically dead just minutes earlier, his tactical awareness remained razor-sharp. He directed the assault with the same precision that had characterized 17 previous successful missions, coordinating 8 different specialists into a single, devastating force. Enemy combatants inside the compound responded to the assault with the confusion of fighters who had believed themselves secure in their mountain fortress. Muzzle flashes erupted from defensive positions that Thompson hadn't identified during surveillance, indicating that the compound's security was more sophisticated than intelligence had suggested. Morrison moved through the chaos with the fluid precision of someone whose tactical instincts operated beyond conscious thought. His physical condition remained compromised, his grip strength was reduced, his balance occasionally faltered, and his endurance was operating at perhaps 60% of normal capacity. But his combat effectiveness remained devastatingly high because his understanding of tactical dynamics allowed him to position himself where skill mattered more than raw physical capability. Cassandra followed Morrison through the compound, maintaining overwatch on his medical condition while simultaneously providing combat medical support for the assault. Her dual focus created a unique perspective. On the battle, she could see the tactical situation unfolding while monitoring vital signs that indicated Morrison's cardiovascular system was still recovering from the cardiac event. The compound's layout proved more complex than their surveillance had revealed. Underground passages connected buildings in ways that allowed enemy combatants to move between structures without exposing themselves to the assault team's coordinated fire. These hidden routes explained why the defensive response had been more organized than expected. Chun repositioned his sniper support to provide overwatch for team members, advancing through areas where concealed enemy movement had been detected. His scope identified muzzle flashes from positions that hadn't been visible during their daylight surveillance, requiring tactical adjustments that demonstrated the team's ability to adapt to evolving combat situations. The Walsh brothers cleared the main building with methodical precision, their coordinated movement patterns allowing them to cover each other's advances while maintaining suppressive fire on defensive positions. Their synchronization had been developed through years of training, but it was their intuitive understanding of each other's tactical thinking that made them devastatingly effective in close-quarters combat. Thompson identified and neutralized additional defensive positions that had been cleverly concealed during their surveillance phase. His expertise in demolitions allowed him to distinguish between structural elements that could be destroyed safely and load-bearing components that might bring down entire sections of the compound. Rodriguez monitored communications frequencies for any indication that the assault had been detected by enemy forces outside the immediate area. His equipment registered no transmissions, suggesting that calls for reinforcement had been successful, confirming that their electronic warfare phase had achieved its objectives. Garcia's linguistic analysis revealed that several of the voices in the compound belonged to non-combatants, likely support personnel or possibly hostages, rather than active fighters. This intelligence guided tactical decisions about which areas could be cleared with maximum aggression versus which required more careful approach to minimize civilian casualties. Anderson maintained suppressive fire that prevented enemy combatants from organizing coordinated defensive responses. His ammunition discipline and tactical positioning allowed him to support multiple team members simultaneously while conserving resources for extended engagement if necessary. The most remarkable aspect of the assault was Morrison's continued effectiveness despite the medical crisis he'd experienced just minutes earlier. His tactical decision-making remained sharp, his coordination of team movements was flawless, and his leadership under fire demonstrated why SEALs followed him through missions that other commanders wouldn't attempt. Cassandra found herself in the unique position of monitoring a cardiac patient who was simultaneously commanding one of the most complex special operations assaults she'd ever witnessed. Morrison's vital signs showed ongoing cardiovascular stress, but his tactical performance remained at the elite level that had made him legendary within the special operations community. 20 minutes into the assault, Team 7 had established control over two of the compound's three main structures. Enemy resistance was decreasing as defensive positions were systematically neutralized, but intelligence gathering had revealed that Nasir was likely positioned in the third building. The structure that appeared to be more heavily fortified than initial surveillance had indicated. Morrison coordinated the final phase of their assault with tactical precision that took into account the building's defensive advantages while minimizing exposure for his team members. His plan involved simultaneous approaches from three directions, with demolitions creating confusion while sniper fire prevented organized defensive responses. But as Morrison positioned himself for the final assault phase, Cassandra noticed troubling changes in his physiological indicators. His heart rate was becoming irregular again, his breathing showed signs of increased stress, and his movement pattern suggested that his cardiovascular system was struggling to maintain the demands of sustained combat operations. Pressure point revival technique had successfully restarted Morrison's cardiac and respiratory functions, but it hadn't addressed the underlying conditions that had caused his heart to fail during the initial assault phase. His body was still operating under the same physiological stress that had triggered the cardiac event, and the demands of combat were pushing his cardiovascular system toward another potential failure. Chun reported that the third building showed signs of sophisticated defensive preparation, including what appeared to be armored positions and possibly explosive devices designed to prevent forced entry. The structure's defensive capabilities suggested that Nasir understood his position was being targeted and had prepared accordingly. Walsh brothers confirmed their readiness for coordinated breach of the final structure, but their approach would require Morrison to coordinate timing with split-second precision. Any hesitation or communication failure during the breach phase could result in casualties among team members who would be exposed to defensive fire. Thompson calculated explosive charges that would neutralize the building's defensive positions without destroying intelligence materials that might be present inside. His demolitions expertise was critical for ensuring that the final assault phase achieved mission objectives without eliminating the intelligence gathering opportunities that justified the operation's risks. Garcia's analysis of intercepted communication suggested that Nasir was indeed present in the final building, possibly with several bodyguards and potentially with non-combatant personnel, whose presence would complicate assault tactics. The intelligence indicated that the target was aware of the ongoing assault and was preparing for a final defensive stand. Anderson prepared to provide covering fire for the final assault phase, but his ammunition status indicated that sustained engagement would require careful resource management. The tactical situation was approaching the point where success would depend more on precision than firepower. Rodriguez maintained communications with base operations, providing updates on mission progress while monitoring for any indication that enemy reinforcements might be approaching from the valley below. His intelligence gathering confirmed that the assault remained undetected by forces outside the immediate target area. As Morrison prepared to initiate the final phase of their assault, Cassandra faced another impossible medical decision. His vital signs indicated that his cardiovascular system was approaching another crisis point, but the mission was so close to completion that medical intervention might compromise the safety of all 8 team members. Morrison raised his hand to signal the final assault, but Cassandra could see the tremor that indicated his nervous system was again beginning to falter. His tactical mind remained sharp, his leadership was flawless, but his body was preparing to fail him at the moment when his team needed him most. The compound's final building waited in the mountain darkness, containing the target they'd tracked for 6 days, through some of the most treacherous terrain in Afghanistan. Inside, Nasir was preparing for a final defensive stand that would test every aspect of their tactical training and operational experience. And as Morrison's hand began to drop in the signal that would send his team into the final phase of their assault, Cassandra realized that the next few minutes would determine whether the ghost protocol she'd used to revive him would prove to be a miracle of ancient medicine or a temporary reprieve before a final, irreversible cardiac failure. Morrison's signal dropped, and the final building erupted in coordinated chaos as Team 7 executed their most complex breach yet. But something went wrong in the first 3 seconds. The building's defensive preparations were far more sophisticated than their intelligence had indicated. Shaped charges that should have neutralized defensive positions instead triggered secondary explosions that suggested the structure had been rigged with sophisticated counter-assault measures. Chun's sniper shot, aimed at eliminating a rooftop gunner, sparked a cascade of defensive fire from positions that hadn't been visible during surveillance. The enemy had prepared for exactly this type of assault, positioning weapons and personnel in ways that created overlapping fields of fire, designed to trap attacking forces in a killing zone. The Walsh brothers found their synchronized breach blocked by reinforced barriers that forced them to improvise entry routes under heavy defensive fire. Michael discovered that the eastern approach had been booby-trapped with explosive devices designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Stephen's western entry was blocked by steel plates that required demolitions to penetrate, creating delays that allowed defenders to establish coordinated firing positions. Thompson's carefully calculated explosives encountered unexpected resistance from structural modifications that had been made specifically to defeat forced entry attempts. The building's defenders had reinforced critical areas with materials that absorbed explosive force while redirecting blast energy in ways that actually strengthened their defensive positions. Garcia's linguistic analysis revealed that the defenders were communicating in multiple languages and using tactical terminology that indicated professional military training rather than the insurgent background that intelligence had suggested. The defensive coordination was too sophisticated. For amateur fighters, they were facing opponents with special operations experience. Rodriguez detected electronic jamming equipment that was interfering with their communications and potentially alerting distant enemy forces to their presence. The compound's electronic warfare capabilities were far beyond what their intelligence had indicated, suggesting that Nazir's operation was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Anderson found his covering fire positions compromised by defensive arrangements that had been designed specifically to neutralize suppressive fire tactics. The enemy had studied American special operations procedures and prepared countermeasures that demonstrated intimate familiarity with SEAL assault techniques, but most critically, the increased tactical demands were pushing Morrison's compromised cardiovascular system beyond sustainable limits. Cassandra could see that his stress indicators were approaching the levels that had triggered his previous cardiac arrest, but the complexity of the tactical situation made medical intervention impossible without compromising the entire team's safety. Morrison adapted to the unexpected defensive sophistication with tactical brilliance that demonstrated why he had survived 17 previous missions in similar circumstances. He recognized that they were facing opponents who understood their methods and had prepared accordingly, which meant standard assault techniques would likely result in casualties among his team members. "Ghost Protocol," Morrison whispered into his radio, using terminology that Team 7 had never heard before. The phrase triggered immediate responses from every team member, though none of them understood what it meant. Shun shifted to Overwatch, positions that prioritized team member protection over target elimination. The Walsh brothers abandoned their coordinated breach and moved to defensive positions that offered better protection from the sophisticated crossfire they were encountering. Thompson began deploying explosive devices designed for area denial rather than structural destruction, creating barriers that would prevent enemy movement while providing cover for team repositioning. Garcia focused his communications monitoring on detecting any indication that the assault had been compromised or that enemy reinforcements were approaching, Rodriguez activated emergency communication protocols that would alert base operations to potential extraction needs while maintaining operational security. Anderson shifted to ammunition conservation tactics that prioritize precision over suppressive fire, recognizing that extended engagement might be necessary. But Morrison's Ghost Protocol involved tactical adjustments that went beyond standard special operations procedures. He was implementing techniques that none of his team members had encountered in their training, methods that seemed designed for situations where conventional tactics had failed and survival depended on approaches that defied standard doctrine. Cassandra realized that Morrison was drawing on experience and training that went beyond his official military background. His tactical adaptations showed familiarity with warfare methods that weren't taught in conventional special operations schools, techniques that suggested exposure to conflicts and training environments that weren't part of his documented service record. The building's defenders responded to Team 7's tactical adjustments with countermeasures that demonstrated they were also implementing non-standard techniques. Their defensive coordination showed influences from multiple military traditions, combining American special operations methods with tactics that appeared to be drawn from Soviet-era training and Middle Eastern insurgency experience. Morrison moved to the modified tactical environment with fluid precision that took into account both the enemy's sophisticated defenses and his own compromised physical condition. His leadership during this phase was unlike anything his team had witnessed. He was simultaneously commanding a complex assault while compensating for cardiovascular limitations that should have made combat operations impossible. Cassandra found herself providing combat medical support while monitoring Morrison's vital signs for any indication that another cardiac event was imminent. Her position gave her a unique perspective on both the tactical situation and the medical crisis that could unfold at any moment if Morrison's heart failed again under stress. The assault on the final building evolved into a chess match between two forces that understood each other's capabilities and limitations. Morrison's tactical adjustments were countered by defensive responses that indicated the enemy commander also possessed elite-level training and experience. The engagement became a test of tactical innovation rather than conventional firepower. Chun identified enemy positions that had been concealed using camouflage techniques that suggested training by intelligence services rather than traditional military forces. His sniper skills were being challenged by opponents who understood advanced concealment and knew how to minimize exposure while maintaining effective defensive fire. The Walsh brothers adapted their close-quarters techniques to account for defensive preparations that had been designed specifically to counter synchronized assault methods. Their coordination remained flawless, but they were being forced to improvise solutions to tactical problems they had never encountered in training. Thompson discovered that the building's explosive defenses included devices that were designed to trigger chain reactions if not disarmed in specific sequences. His demolitions expertise was being tested by opponents who understood advanced explosive engineering and had implemented countermeasures that could turn his own charges against Team 7. Garcia's analysis revealed that the defenders were using communication methods that combined multiple encryption techniques with cultural references that would be meaningless to anyone without specific regional knowledge. Their operational security was sophisticated, enough to suggest intelligence service training rather than insurgent background. Rodriguez found his electronic warfare capabilities challenged by jamming equipment that was more advanced than anything they had encountered in previous operations. The enemy's electronic capabilities suggested access to military-grade equipment that should have been beyond the reach of insurgent forces. Anderson adapted his weapons employment to account for defensive positions that had been designed to deflect rather than absorb incoming fire. His tactical positioning was being challenged by opponents who understood how to use terrain and structural modifications to neutralize suppressive fire advantages. The most remarkable aspect of the engagement was Morrison's continued effectiveness despite physiological stress that should have incapacitated him. His tactical decision-making remained sharp even as his cardiovascular system approached another potential failure point, demonstrating a level of mental discipline that went beyond conventional military training. Cassandra monitored Morrison's condition while simultaneously tracking the medical status of other team members who were operating under stress levels that pushed human performance to its limits. Her combat medical training was being tested by situations that weren't covered in standard protocols. She was treating the effects of psychological stress that went beyond normal combat exposure. 30 minutes into the final assault, Team 7 had established partial control over the building's perimeter, but had been unable to locate, Nazir, or neutralize the sophisticated defensive network that protected him. The engagement had evolved from a standard capture mission into a complex tactical problem that required solutions beyond conventional special operations doctrine. Morrison's leadership during this phase demonstrated tactical innovation that impressed even his experienced team members. He was implementing solutions to tactical problems that none of them had encountered before, using methods that seemed to combine multiple military traditions in ways that created unexpected advantages. But Cassandra could see that Morrison's physiological reserves were approaching depletion. His cardiovascular system was operating under stress levels that would have caused failure in anyone without his exceptional conditioning, and the pressure point revival technique that had saved him earlier was providing diminishing returns as his body's energy reserves became exhausted. The tactical situation was approaching a critical decision point where Morrison would need to choose between continuing the assault with diminishing chances of success or initiating extraction procedures that would allow Team 7 to withdraw with minimal casualties, but without achieving mission objectives. As Morrison prepared to make this decision, Cassandra realized that the next few minutes would test not only their tactical capabilities, but also the limits of human physiology when pushed beyond normal survival parameters. The Ghost Protocol that had brought Morrison back from clinical death was about to face its ultimate test in a situation where failure would mean more than just mission compromise. It would mean the loss of America's most elite special operations team in circumstances that would never be fully explained or understood. Morrison's decision came with the sudden clarity that only emerges in moments when survival hangs by threads too thin to measure. He keyed his radio one final time, his voice carrying an authority that transcended his compromised physical condition. Execute Lazarus Protocol. All stations execute the Lazarus Protocol. None of Team 7 had ever heard those words before, but something in Morrison's tone triggered responses that seemed to bypass conscious thought. Chun abandoned his sniper position and moved to coordinates that Morrison transmitted through hand signals that weren't part of standard SEAL communication. The Walsh brothers shifted into formation patterns that created geometric advantages none of them could have calculated, but all of them somehow understood. Thompson armed explosive devices using sequences that defied his demolitions training but felt intuitively correct. Garcia began transmitting on frequencies that weren't in their communication plan but somehow reached the exact networks needed to coordinate extraction. Rodriguez activated beacon systems that would guide rescue forces to their position through methods that weren't part of standard protocols. Anderson moved into overwatch positions that provided protection for tactical maneuvers that hadn't been planned but were executing with mechanical precision. Each team member was performing actions that transcended their training, as if Morrison's command had activated capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. But it was Cassandra who understood what was happening. The Lazarus Protocol wasn't just tactical innovation, it was Morrison accessing training and experience that went beyond conventional military background. He was implementing techniques that suggested exposure to psychological conditioning, methods that weren't part of standard special operations Programs. Morrison moved to the building's final defenses with fluid precision that seemed to anticipate enemy actions before they occurred. His tactical awareness had expanded beyond normal human capability, as if the cardiac death he'd experienced had somehow enhanced rather than diminished his operational effectiveness. The building's defenders found their sophisticated preparations rendered ineffective by assault techniques that didn't follow recognizable patterns. Team 7 was executing coordinated maneuvers that seemed to violate tactical doctrine while achieving objectives that conventional methods had failed to accomplish. Within 8 minutes of Morrison's Lazarus Protocol command, Ahmad Nazar was secured, intelligence materials were gathered, and Team 7 was moving toward extraction coordinates that had appeared in their mission parameters without explanation. The assault had transitioned from stalemate to complete success through methods that none of them could have described in operational debriefings. But as they reached the extraction point, Morrison's enhanced capabilities began to fade. His cardiovascular system, pushed beyond sustainable limits by whatever psychological conditioning the Lazarus Protocol had activated, finally approached complete failure. The technique that had made him superhuman for 8 crucial minutes was extracting a price that has already compromised. Physiology couldn't afford. Cassandra found herself facing the final test of the ghost protocol she had used to revive him. Morrison was entering cardiac arrest again, but this time his body was showing signs of systematic failure that went beyond simple heart rhythm problems. The Lazarus Protocol had burned through his physiological reserves in ways that conventional medicine couldn't address. As helicopter rotors approached through the mountain darkness, Morrison collapsed for the second time that night. But now Cassandra understood that saving him would require more than pressure point techniques. It would require her to access the same unconventional knowledge that Morrison had used to command the impossible mission they had just completed. She knelt beside Morrison's motionless form and began applying techniques that combined the ancient pressure point methods with psychological conditioning procedures that she had studied but never fully understood. Her hands moved in patterns that seemed to bypass normal neural pathways, targeting not just Morrison's cardiovascular system but the deeper psychological conditioning that had allowed him to access superhuman capabilities. The extraction helicopter arrived as Morrison's heart began beating again, but this time his revival was different. The eyes that opened weren't just those of a SEAL commander who had survived cardiac arrest. They belonged to someone who had accessed capabilities that weren't supposed to exist within normal human parameters. As Team 7 loaded into the helicopter with their prisoner and intelligence materials, none of them spoke about what they had witnessed. The Lazarus Protocol, Morrison's impossible recovery, and Cassandra's unconventional medical techniques weren't topics that would appear in their operational reports. During the flight back to base, Morrison's vital signs stabilized at levels that shouldn't have been possible for someone who had experienced 2 cardiac arrests in one night. His recovery suggested that the combination of ancient medical techniques and advanced psychological conditioning had triggered physiological adaptations that transcended normal human limitations. Cassandra monitored his condition throughout the flight, but her medical training couldn't explain what she was observing. Morrison's cardiovascular system was functioning better than it had before the mission began, as if the stress of near-death experience had somehow optimized rather than damaged his physiological capabilities. When they reached base operations, Morrison's debriefing was classified at levels that prevented even Team 7 from accessing the full report. The official record would show a successful capture mission with no mention of cardiac events, ghost protocols, or medical techniques that defied conventional understanding. But Cassandra kept detailed notes about the pressure point revival methods she had used, documenting techniques that had saved Morrison's life through principles that modern medicine didn't recognize. Her records would remain buried in classified files, but they contained information that could revolutionize emergency medical treatment if anyone was ever authorized to study them. In the weeks that followed, Team 7 noticed subtle changes in Morrison's leadership style and tactical capabilities. His decision-making had acquired an almost supernatural precision, and his ability to anticipate enemy actions had improved beyond what experience alone could explain. Whatever had happened during his cardiac arrests had enhanced rather than diminished his operational effectiveness. More remarkably, other team members began reporting improvements in their own capabilities that couldn't be explained through normal training progression. The Lazarus Protocol had somehow affected the entire team, creating enhancements in tactical awareness and physical performance that persisted long after the mission was completed. Cassandra's medical assessments revealed that each team member was showing physiological improvements that defied conventional understanding. Their stress responses had become more efficient, their reaction times had improved, and their ability to process complex tactical information had increased beyond normal human parameters. But the most profound change was in Morrison himself. The commander who had died twice on a mountain in Afghanistan had returned with capabilities that transcended normal special operations training. His subsequent missions achieved success rates that were statistically impossible, and his tactical innovations became legendary within classified special operations communities. Years later, when researchers finally gained access to sanitized versions of Team 7's mission reports, they would find references to medical and tactical techniques that couldn't be explained through conventional military science. The Ghost Protocol that had brought Morrison back from clinical death would inspire decades of classified research into the key boundaries between life and death. But for Cassandra, the mountain in Afghanistan had taught her that human capabilities extended far beyond what modern medicine understood. The ancient techniques that had saved Morrison's life represented knowledge that conventional training had abandoned, and she spent the rest of her career quietly studying methods that could push human physiology beyond accepted limitations. 7 never spoke publicly about what happened during those 3 minutes when their commander lay clinically dead on Afghan stone. The pressure point revival, the Lazarus Protocol, and the superhuman capabilities that emerged from near-death experience remained classified secrets that would never appear in official military records. But in the shadowy world of special operations, where the impossible becomes routine and legends are born from classified missions, the story of the quiet medic who brought back the dead with ancient knowledge became whispered proof that the boundaries between life and death are far more flexible than anyone dares to acknowledge. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.